Mai fasta mai fóitéiriú Síla Julia e móvé bhúd visa am tia túla I've got 3 day log a Guernsey a Giri, and I will continue in English because this is our common language. It was Guernsey. I was saying I'm going to talk to you a little bit about language revitalisation in Guernsey and Jersey. So where are the Channel Islands? Not that any of you don't know, I hope. And I know that some of you have been there. They are small islands in the English Channel. We have a Yes, okay. Between England and France, much closer to the coast of France than to the English coast. And the linguistic situation has a lot to do with the position of the islands in terms of culture and language, much closer to France, but not quite part of France. But in terms of politics, very much linked to the United Kingdom. Okay, so a little bit of background. I don't expect you to read all this necessarily. As Adrian said, Guernsey and Jersey are both self-governing dependencies, crown dependencies of the British Crown, like the Isle of Man. Something to note is the Channel Islands as such, as an entity, doesn't really exist. They are very much two what they call bailiwicks. The island of Jersey, if I go back to this a bit, Jersey is the biggest island, much closer to the coast of France. And there actually had more French influence than the other islands as well for that reason. Jersey is the biggest one and has its own parliament and regulates its own affairs, as does the Isle of Man. Guernsey's parliament or political system also covers the other islands, the rest of the islands. Basically it's Jersey, and then the rest of the islands are separate. Although Sark and Alderney also have their own parliaments, they are subsumed under Guernsey, for political purposes as well. Okay. One thing that everyone will tell you when you go to the Channel Islands, one thing they're very, very proud of is that they were part of the winning side on the Battle of Hastings in 1066 because they were part of Normandy at that point, and therefore their link with the British Crown is that the Queen is the Duke. So the toast that I know here you have the Queen our Lord, there it's the Queen our Duke is the toast that's given at official events. In terms of population, Jersey's population has recently topped 100,000. It is, after all, the biggest island, but not as big as the Isle of Man. Jersey is about 20 miles long. Guernsey is 9 miles long at the longest point and has a population of 63,000. Although that sounds a lot less, it is the most densely populated of all the islands that we're talking about. Alderney and Sark are about the same size of landmass, but Alderney has a considerably larger population. Alderney's got almost 2,500 people, whereas Sark has only got 600. And each of these inhabited islands, there are other smaller islands which don't have a very big population or no population at all permanently. Each of these islands has had or has its own language. And they're all varieties of Norman, as you would expect from islands which belonged to Normandy before the Norman conquest, although they had actually only been part of Normandy for about 100 years before that. And another thing they've got in common with the Isle of Man is a Viking heritage. And the Vikings founded the Duchy of Normandy before the Norman conquest. And there are a lot of Viking words which have been included in the languages of the Channel Islands, particularly things to do with the sea. Bate, for example, is boat, which I think is similar in Manx as well. Okay, and like the Isle of Man, all these islands have had considerable immigration from the UK, and this has had a big influence on both the culture and the language, of course. So nowadays, up to 2/3 of the population have some kind of UK heritage, and maybe up to a half weren't even born in the islands. Another major issue in the history of the islands, and which also has an impact on language, is the evacuation in World War II. The Germans occupied the Channel Islands, the only part of the British Isles to be occupied in World War II. And for many of the older people, this is still the most important event in their lives. It was recently the 70th anniversary of liberation, really big event. And people often blame the evacuation of most of the children just at the beginning of the war for the break in language transmission. But then again, if you compare that to other places in the world where at least half, possibly up to 90% of the world's languages are under threat of disappearing within the next 100 years, then you have to question to what extent that was the major factor. I think to a large extent it has been blamed for language loss, when in fact people also need to look at their own attitudes and behaviour as well. So in all of these islands, the majority language is now English, but French, standard French, Parisian French, has played an important part in the past. French used to be the language of education, the language of the courts, the language of government, etc. Although a lot of the ordinary people often didn't speak French. If they spoke it, they would have learned it at school. And the island languages, the Norman languages, were the language of the people right up until about the 1920s, when English started taking over, not just in what we call the high domains, things like education, etc., but also in the family as well. And that was really, I think, when the decline started of the local languages. But increasingly now, and I have done research into attitudes towards language in the islands, increasingly you have positive attitudes towards the local languages. People are now seeing them as part of the kind of collective heritage which needs to be maintained. And although formally, and still among some of the older people, they still have quite low status, particularly in relation in comparison to French. So just talk a little bit about the islands themselves. As I said, Jersey is the largest island. Its language, the name of the island in its own language is Giri. So the name of the language is Giri. I'm going to, in a minute, I'm going to try to show you a couple of YouTube videos so that you can get an idea of what the languages sound like. I don't know how many of you speak French. Okay, because people often assume that these are dialects of French. They are dialects of Norman, which is a cousin language to French, not necessarily a branch of French. And French speakers often remark on how little of these languages they can understand. One of the problems that we have with these islands, with the languages in terms of language maintenance, language revitalisation, is that the people who support language revitalisation often believe their own propaganda too much. And often the numbers of speakers is boosted, is inflated to give a good impression of language maintenance. So that in the only census recently which has counted the number of speakers in both islands is in 2001. And in Jersey there were nearly 3,000 speakers at that point counted. But then at that point 2/3 of those were over the age of 64, and that was nearly 15 years ago. But only 113 said that Giri was actually their habitual language, which is quite a big difference between can speak some and actually speaks it all the time. Unfortunately, I tried to put a link in here. When I do this in other places, I can just go straight to it, but unfortunately here I have to go out of the PowerPoint and do it slightly less professionally. Can you see that? No, you can't. I have to now adjust something else. Connect to a projector and go like that. Okay, so this is actually this is the language office at Tony Scott Warren in Jersey, and this is a quick little video of how to say hello and welcome in Giri.
Bonjour, c'est bienvenue. Bonjour, c'est le bienvenu.
Bonjour, c'est le bienvenu.
Bonjour, c'est le bienvenu.
Okay, so you get the idea. It goes on in that vein for a bit longer. Okay, so c'est le bienvenu is welcome in Jersey. What's interesting is that I do what we call language documentation in both islands, trying to record some of the last speakers, which is, I think, a very important thing to do. And this phrase, be welcome, is something you never say in Guernsey because it's ordering people to be welcome. Okay, right, so back to this slide. Oops, I hope. Oh dear. Right, okay, good. Okay, so Guernsey is the second largest island in the Channel Islands. In its own language, the name of the island is Guernsey, so the name of the language is Guernsey, which is extraordinarily difficult for Anglophones, English speakers, to say, and this is one of the big problems that we have. So it ends up, because of the spelling, the dominant spelling tends to be French-based. English speakers can't speak or read French, so they tend to call it things like Genesies, because of the S on the end, and that's one of the problems that we have. So people also call it Guernsey's language. You also see later in in my presentation, a lot of people still call it the patois, which is French for dialect. And in French, this actually has quite connotations of a bad way to speak, of incorrect language. But people in the Channel Islands didn't really know that. They only thought that patois was the name of their language. So you often hear people calling their languages patois, and it's much easier for English speakers to say that. So likewise, in the 2001 census, 1,327 people said they were fluent. Again, 2/3 of those, or 70% of those, were over 64 years old in 2001. And we now think that there may only be about 200 to 300 really fluent speakers left, mainly aged over the age of 80. So this is where the Isle of Man was, in, say, about the 1950s, I think. And I have tried to find out how many younger speakers there are. I only know of 6 or perhaps 7 people under the age of 60 who can hold a conversation, a proper conversation, without practicing in advance, without preparing in Guernsey, and I'm one of them. But on the good news side, the youngest native speaker, who is actually about 47, has recently had a small child, and she's now 1.5, and he's speaking Guernsey to her. So this is hopefully the start of something new to come. But she doesn't have a lot of other people to talk to, and that's one of the main problems. Yeah. Okay, so let's quickly see if we can show you what Guernsey sounds like. Right. You can't see that again either, can you? No. Right. Okay, good. So this is an event that was held a couple of years ago, a tea party concert by one of the main language maintenance group, La Dienne du Fouet, which means the gang from the west. Come on. Okay, so he said, "Welcome to our concert. I'm really pleased to see you all here this afternoon." And if any of you French speaker understand much of that? No. It is quite different. Oops, no, I don't want to press that button. Right, okay. Right, I've got another video that I'll show you later if there's time. Okay, we're getting on a bit. Right, so just the smaller languages. Sidchai, the language of Sark, may have perhaps 15, perhaps 17 speakers now. They're all aged over 70, probably older. I have been there, went there a few years ago now to record some of the speakers. I don't have any videos, I'm afraid, to show you of that. We haven't found much interest in revitalisation in Sark at the moment. So Setchai, the language of Sark, is probably going to die out in a very few years now. But we do have recordings, and there are also recordings made back in the 70s, both of songs and of people speaking. So if there is interest in the future, there are some recordings that can be used. Unlike in Alderney, where the last speakers died in the 1960s, I don't know if you know that the whole population of Alderney was evacuated in the Second World War, and it became a prison camp for slave workers who were building the fortifications for the Nazis in the Channel Islands. And that was really the death knell for the language, because everyone got scattered. There have been recent efforts to revitalise Origny, as the language is called. The name of the island in its language is Origny, and the language is called Origny. It's also Origny in its French pronunciation is also the name of the Channel Islands airline. I don't know if any of you have been there on that. Okay, so revitalisation in Alderney is severely hampered by the lack of records, particularly of audio recordings of the language. Okay, there are other languages in the Channel Islands, but they're not the ones I'm going to be talking about today. But just to say that Portuguese in particular, there were Portuguese people came over from the 1970s on, often generally to work in hotels. And there are people who speak Polish, Latvian. People come from Latvia to work in the flower industry. Dutch, German, Indian, and Philippine languages are all spoken in the Channel Islands. And we think there are probably more speakers of Portuguese now than there are of the indigenous languages there. And in some cases that leads to a bit of rivalry. So some speakers of Guernsey complain, for example, that there's more coverage of Portuguese on the TV than there is of the local languages. But I think that all minority languages actually face similar problems, similar issues, particularly in an English-dominant environment. And it would be perhaps more productive to try and join forces, for example, to promote bilingualism in general, to promote language maintenance, because you can already see that some of the children of the Portuguese workers are losing their language. On the other hand, they're also quite good at learning the local languages because they're also Romance languages and have some similar sounds. So in the schools in Jersey where they're teaching Giri, some of the Portuguese kids are actually doing quite well. And in the census in Guernsey in 2001, 8 people of Portuguese origin said that they spoke Guernsey as well. So being from another place doesn't necessarily stop you from learning the local language. Also, the largest immigrant group by far, of course, is from the UK. And the speakers of English are often blamed by local people. This influx of not just English speakers, but English culture is often blamed for the demise of the local languages. But actually, in my own research, as I said, I've been looking into language attitudes, and the origin of the person actually had no effect whatsoever on people's attitudes towards the language. And as you find here, often people from outside the island are very interested in learning the local languages to get in touch with the local culture. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about language revitalisation in Guernsey first and then in Jersey, and then try to draw a few conclusions, commonalities, etc. The main things, there are 2 main foci to language revitalisation, or language-related activities in Guernsey. The first of them is language festivals, language competitions. And this is a group called the Asobia Guernsey Dancers. This is the Assembly of Guernsey People Dancers. They don't necessarily speak the language. I know that people in the Isle of Man are quite interested in linking other cultural things such as music and dance with the language. In Guernsey and Jersey, most of the really traditional music was lost in the 17th century when there were very strict Puritans in charge of the government, and they forbade people to sing and dance. So a lot of the singing and dancing that's done nowadays is been re-imported from Normandy, and is often actually not in the local languages, it's often in French. So this is kind of slightly strange thing to do, but the festivals are very good for awareness raising because they have coverage in the local media, and they bring in tourists and other people, relatives, to watch the activities. The other thing that's most prominent in Guernsey at the moment is extracurricular lessons. Not in both islands, Guernsey and Jersey, the local language is not part of the school curriculum. And there's nothing like the Bunskol here. So all the teaching in Guernsey is by volunteers, most of them retired. Most of them have got no teacher training. There isn't any syllabus, there aren't any materials hardly. These are only for 30 minutes a week. I have worked out that if you teach a language for 30 minutes a week for just the school term, if you compare to what the American Army reckon is necessary to become fluent in a language, it would take you 40 or 50 years at that rate. So they're not actually likely to be anything like effective in getting children fluent, unfortunately, particularly as it's the teaching is not of great quality because the teachers have no training whatsoever. There's a bit of an ideology that you have to be a native speaker in order to teach the language properly, which has hampered efforts, I think, so far. Because I think you probably are familiar with this idea that if you speak a language, you can teach it, which is not necessarily the case at all, unfortunately. But these lessons, they now take up a lot of the time and energy of all the people who are involved in language, because it's a relatively small group of people who are involved in language-related activities. However, in 2002, there was an initiative by one of the newly elected politicians in Guernsey. There was almost a revolution in terms of the replacement in the island parliament of let's say, old blood by new blood. And one of the new politicians was very keen on raising the awareness of the language and doing something to try and save the language. And so he launched a language commission, which Adrian is actually involved with, and so am I to a certain extent. And so here's a kind of picture of some kids doing a recitation as well. I'll talk a little bit about that more later, but unfortunately so far there hasn't been a lot come out of that. Yeah. Okay. So we talk about new speakers of language. I'm very much in favour of trying to increase the number of new speakers, people who don't necessarily come from the background of the language, who don't have any history of speaking the language in their family, but who want to learn the language. I think this is a major way of taking the language forward into the future. So there are adult lessons, but they're only really at beginner and only recently have post-beginner lessons started. And there are things like Genesee in the pub, Genesee at lunchtime. There are classes run in the town for people who work in the town, might be able to come in their lunchtime. What's been found is often the people who come to the lessons are what we call latent speakers, people who heard the language when they were young, didn't necessarily learn to speak it actively, but have a good idea of the sounds, and as they start to hear more, as they start to learn more, they start to remember more, that they can come up with things they didn't think they knew, they didn't know they knew. And actually this, having those people in the lesson with complete beginners can be a bit difficult, because if people come out with stuff that hasn't been taught in the lessons yet, it's a bit of a problem for the teachers. So what is being done now is try to have a separate lesson for the latent speakers. Okay. The other thing for new speakers, it's I think a very positive development is what we call les buddies. It's actually the origin of the word buddy in English. And that's linked to a song project I'll show you in a minute, which is a variation of what we call the master-apprentice approach to language learning, which is started in California. And what they do is they pair a learner with someone who's more fluent in the language. And in the case of Guernsey and Jersey, this can be an older speaker, a native speaker. Or it can be someone who's learnt it more fluently, for example, here. And I think this is a really good way of the way forward, if you like, for people who have done the beginners courses. Because what we find is that there are people who've done the beginners courses several times because there isn't anything more to go on to. So what they could do is then they could pair up with a more fluent speaker and practice their language. And also as the fluent speakers of Genesee tend to be really, really old. This is also something that can keep the old person active. And it's really good to stave off Alzheimer's, is to keep bilingualism going. Okay. And also you can combine that with language documentation. You can record the session, which is again useful for the learner to listen back and then they can ask questions in the next session. Okay, and also social media is just about starting up in Genesee. There are 2 Facebook pages, not terrifically active at the moment, unfortunately. I'll show you a screenshot. But the idea is that learners are encouraged to express themselves through writing in any way they like. Literacy in Genesee is a problem because there isn't a standardized spelling. Although there are people who have ideas on how it should be spelt. So we try to encourage people to express themselves in any way that they can. Okay, so here's the visual element. So here's an advert for language at lunchtime, last year's poster. And this is another recent initiative, Speed Patois. It's this word patois. Not everyone likes it because they think that it is demeaning word for the language, but it is a word that people can use. And this is sort of speed dating in the language. So anyone who's interested can come along to certain evenings in the pub, and literally you have there 5 minutes, you introduce yourself, and you go on to the next speaker. Again, it tends to be at a fairly basic level of language learning. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. This is the song project. song project was started last year. As I said, and the first video I showed you of Guernsey was a concert by one of the more traditional groups who do singing, and they also present plays in Guernsey in the language festivals. This project is aimed at trying to produce songs in different kinds of genre, in new genre for the language. And it's been quite successful, not just in producing songs, but also in pairing people up in these buddying groups, because the idea was to connect songwriters, which are mostly younger people, with native speakers, so that they could produce these songs. And in a couple of instances, that has actually led to some very nice both productions in terms of music, but also some very nice relationships, almost like sort of what's the word? Substitute grandmother relationships. And one of the young magicians has actually become very good at speaking the language through this, or relatively good. Okay, and here's a picture of the Facebook page some time ago. It changes its cover photo every now and again, but as I said, it's unfortunately not particularly active at the moment. Okay. In the linguistic, what we call the linguistic landscape in linguistics is language in the print environment. And I know that's one of the things that has been quite successful in the Isle of Man, of having Manx on signposts, on various shops, buildings, whatever. It's not just necessarily on buildings, though. On products, we've been quite successful in getting some of the local companies to use some local language in their branding. And so you have this cheese here. It's called Fridor, which is Golden Meadow in Guernsey. And I don't know if you probably can't read this, but there's a little bit of this is patois, ale, of course, that patois word again. And here is a little bit of language here, which says it's probably not doesn't probably also trade descriptions is probably not what it's complying with, because it says it's the best beer made of the most natural ingredients. Yeah, and tastes really good, which is not necessarily the case actually. Okay, and then you've got parish signs set up in, unfortunately this is welcome to the parish of St Martin. This has only been successful in some places, because in some cases the planning authority has actually objected to having signs in the local language. Oh no, there's no room for that there, or it'll get in the way of other things. Yeah. So joined up thinking. Yeah, yeah, and this is something that actually it's quite nice, because it's a family support service which put up its big sign saying "Bienvenue, welcome" in the language, and the people that this is actually aimed at are actually the least likely in terms of demographics to speak the language, so that's quite interesting. Okay, and this is a translation, let's say, of the slogan of the local football team, Guernsey FC, which has now joined the English League and is playing kind of other county sides, let's say county level. Football is very popular in Guernsey. Sports in general are very popular in Guernsey, and there are, for its island, for its size, there are sports people who are quite well known, kind of batting above level, if you like Heather Watson, Matt Letizier, Andy Priot, all come from Guernsey, for example. So this is a translation of braver, stronger, smarter. Although the actual translation of brave is not necessarily something that we've heard people use in Guernsey. This is a problem. We get people doing translations who aren't necessarily fluent speakers, because someone who is older and has grown up with the language as one of their languages of socialization is often assumed to be a native and therefore a fluent speaker. And those three things don't necessarily follow when you've got language attrition going on, people forgetting their language as they get older, or not necessarily having a lot of people to speak to. Okay, but what this has done is raise a lot of awareness about the language. So this is a little bit of Facebook conversation about this on the right. You can't see it, but what they're talking about is one, the translation, and then two, the situation of the language itself. And it ends up with someone saying, "Oh, that's great. Can we help? Can we help to revive the language?" Yeah. Okay, and this is a recent poster that's come out. This is Anna Brehel is how she would be. And she is learning Genesee, one of the younger learners, and she's got round her neck a piece of jewellery that I will tell you about later, which is also in the language. And this is an advert for voting registration. So this is trying to, in the language, trying to get people to register to vote, which is it's interesting because there's no translation. So who's it aimed at? It's aimed at the 80s and 90-year-olds. But using a young person to advertise the need to register to vote. Although also the older people that it's aimed at are very unlikely to have Twitter accounts. Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting that now language is being seen more and more as something which can link you to the island and that can express island identity. There's also a translation service that I will talk about a little bit about later, but the kind of requests that they have are all sorts of things, even tattoos in the language, and someone actually had "carry on beating" tattooed over their heart in Guernsey, which shows a very strong identification with the language. Okay, but on the downside, I know that here, for example, on post office vans, on water authority vans, you've got Manx, not necessarily as big in terms of on the water vans. Yes, it's as big as the English, but here on things like this is the States Works, the sort of arm of the government which goes around fixing things like lampposts and stuff. Functional signs tend not to be in the language. It tends really to be the more symbolic sort of language, unfortunately, that you get on using Guernsey. Okay, so yes, what have we achieved and what are the challenges that we can see so far? As I said, there has been a striking change in attitudes over the last 30 years, so that language is now seen as a valuable commodity for distinctiveness in the language. Particularly, that's the way that politicians see it. I'll come back to that later. However, there is a lack of clear aims, coordination, or strategy. The kind of events that the Language Commission have been organising, the kind of speed patois, that kind of thing, tend to be a bit scattergun. There's not a lot of coordination going on. And things like, as I mentioned, the Planning Authority can reject signposts. There was a language officer. All of the other islands, by the way, have appointed language officers and overtly copying the Isle of Man in that respect. But the Guernsey language officer resigned in 2001 and wasn't replaced. Which is something that hasn't happened here. And of course there are disagreements about spelling, as I mentioned, which makes it quite difficult to produce materials for language learning. As I said, there's limited person power, which leads to a reduced range of activities that can be done because, as I said, the time and energy tends to go on specific projects. And because of partly because of the spelling problem, but also because of the lack of people who are trained to produce this kind of stuff, lack of trained teachers, there's a lack of materials. It's sort of a vicious circle, because if you've got a lack of materials, you've got a lack of people getting fluent, and therefore and a lack of materials that can be used to train more. Language documentation, I think, is a priority, therefore, what the museum's director has called being a backstop for the language, having those recordings just in case the current activities don't work in saving language at the moment. And we do have quite a lot of recordings now, but what we haven't managed to do is analyse them yet, but in a way that can wait. Okay, so one of the problems that we have is it's seen as a language of the past. Again, I'll show you a bit more on that in a minute. But because these festivals and competitions are one of the most visible activities in the language, people dress up in kind of generic old clothing, not even necessarily national or local costume, and it tends to be associated with older people and with so-called traditional activities. Yeah, and also with performance rather than actual use. Okay, so I'll skip over that a bit. What the adult learners, I've been doing research here as well, some of you I've interviewed, because I think it's really important to understand what adult learners would like and what they would like to do with a small language. And really the one thing that comes out most is they would like to be able to speak to people, they would like more people to talk to. So I think this buddying activity is a really good way of getting that going. The other thing that's come out of my research into the learning of Genesee is that the keenest learners tend to be middle middle-aged men. So in terms of demographics, that's a bit worrying. we need more younger people, particularly of childbearing age. Okay, and as I said, we have this is actually a picture of the page from Guernsey from the Endangered Language Archive, which is run from where I work at the University of London, and it's got recordings of languages from all over the world. And this is the entry we've got now. It doesn't say here, but we've got 56 recordings now of about 50 people altogether. So this is a really good record of the language as it's spoken in the 21st century. Okay, on to Jersey then. It's had official support since 1998. The Office du Giri, the Jersey Language Office, was set up then originally with one language officer, the guy I showed you at the beginning, and now it has 2.8 full-time equivalent, or three language officers, which have the support of many of the speakers, which is a good thing. Their focus, however, is on school lessons and on producing materials. Anyone recognise this one? Oh, sorry, that's not right. Anyone recognise this one? It's called. It means the new road, but it's actually. Yeah. But it's actually it's adapted from. Is it Bonnoa? How you say it? Bonnoa. Yeah, something you produced back a long time ago, and they at that time they did visit the Isle of Man, and they took a lot of inspiration from what the Isle of Man has been doing, but I think they still think they're following the Isle of Man's example, but actually they're not in a lot of what they're doing now. They try to promote Giri as modern and traditional. So here's a book of it's Chuprumyenia. It means that first Christmas. It's a Christmas book for young people, and there's a lot more of this. Some of us refer to their office as that bookshop because it's mostly to do with producing written materials, not necessarily on promoting Giri as a spoken language, which I think is perhaps a priority. Here's the website of the Office du Giri, very vibrant, aimed at young people particularly. Every day there's a new phrase. This is, I'm a baker. Si bouloji. Okay, yeah. And of course you can buy stuff from their bookshop. Sorry, nasty here. Okay, in the linguistic landscape there is increasingly more Giri, although if you don't know where it is, it's actually quite hard to find, particularly in the more sort of business-orientated areas of the island. So this is at the port. Welcome to Jersey. As you can see, Giri is the last of the languages on here. Soyez les bienvenus again. And this, I think, is an issue, is the relative size of the local language in all this. Okay, here's one that is all in Giri. This is a recycling lorry, or a bin lorry. Slightly kind of odd. This is St. Helier. He's the patron saint of Jersey, and is the name of the capital of Jersey. And so he's a picture of the saint with his paper and his tins and bottles and plastic. Yeah, okay. And of course, but you get it again, like in Guernsey, it's being used for for commercial purposes as well. You know, as a sort of a way of promoting, of branding the island, if you like. So this is I know you had Black Dog here as well. So this is again, I included that for this reason. Interestingly, this is not a translation of the Black Dog. It's because it's known in Giri as the dog of Boulay. Boulay is a bay there, but this is actually black. This is La Nedru, the black road. A lot of increasing number of roads are named in Giri. Traditionally, the written form of both these languages was French because education was through French, and it's only recently that the actual Giri has been used in the print environment. Okay, I was going to show at this point another video. Have I got time to do that? Okay, right. Again, I have to go out of this, unfortunately. Press escape. Okay, so this is one of the language officers telling you about using Giri in promoting local products. Can you see that? Good. Right. Amazing.
Neuf un exemple de ce qu'on gère, vous pouvez aller à Saint-Étienne, on gère. C'est une bonne chose de pouvoir faire la publicité en gère, parce que c'est là où de gérer, c'est des types modernes et la tradition. Donc, je voudrais encourager l'usage du gère dans les commerces et dans toute la publicité que nous faisons ici en gère.
That's just like French.
You've, okay, so a lot of you can understand it. Yes, it is quite like French. It's more like French than Genesese because it's closer to France. Yes, and he's one of the language officers. This is Geraint. None of the language officers are native speakers, by the way, partly because they're too young to be native speakers. Yeah. Okay, let's get out of that. Right. This is him. Well, what's he talking about? Anyone? I know some of you do understand French, but any.
Generating publicity and business.
Okay, right. Yes. What's interesting is.
Traditional.
Yeah. Yes, it's modern. It's traditional. Okay, so you understood that. That's great. But the people it's aimed at are not necessarily going to understand that, and there's no subtitles or anything. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
didn't you say that they spoke French as well?
No, most people don't actually speak French. Actually, the teaching of French is extremely poor. For places that are so close to France, the level of French is appalling, frankly. Yeah, and that's partly because they do it in the same way as it's taught in Britain. Yeah, okay, so here we go again. Okay, so yes, so Giri is increasingly seen as something which is valuable, particularly for distinctiveness of the island. It's also, well, according to the Language Office, the official minority language of Jersey, which is, I think, a problematic thing to say. This is not something that government says, actually. I've looked and looked to find anything about officialization, official status. Although the Language Office claims it's got official status, this is not something that the government actually says. Although the Jersey government website does have this headline with the translation in Giri. There is Giri on the £1 note. Before you get too jealous, this is the only bit of money that's got any Giri on it. And the Giri is actually a lot smaller than the other languages. So you've got, it's actually on this side, it's only in French and Giri. On the other side, it's in English. And there is a point of view that French is unofficial language of the islands, which for some people is a problem in bringing Giri in because they see Giri as a dialect of French, which linguistically can be challenged, but it's a point of view that's quite strong. There's also some stamps which have a little bit of Giri on here, and again, I think it's slightly problematic that in all of these, Giri is the much smaller of the languages shown, which kind of tends to, I think, underline its minority status. Okay, so here you have some more examples of this from official signs. This is at the airport. Again, welcome, bienvenue à Giri. And then peace, pocket, then pay in very small language here because you wouldn't actually necessarily need that because there aren't any people who don't speak English anymore. Okay. There is also bottom-up use of Giri, grassroots, if you like. This is an anti-poverty demonstration with slightly strange. This says poverty to the backside of the dog. But why it would say that, I'm not sure. Yeah, but Okay. One of the most positive developments is a band called Badlabec, which means chatterboxes in Giri. And these are young people singing in Giri. And they have produced recordings for the Language Office for use in schools, but also very popular on the island in general. And they... The 2015 Island Games were held in Jersey. You may know about those. And Badlabec were invited to perform at the Island Games, actually the closing of the opening ceremony. Again, have I got a little time to show this video? Oh, I haven't. I'll see if this one works, because I hadn't got that ready. This is them. it's these non-traditional songs in Giri. They do sing traditional songs as well. Yeah, and I think they have a very important role to play in getting young people involved in being interested in Giri. Right, good. Okay, so starting to wrap up now at last. What's been achieved and what are the challenges in Jersey? Up till recently, they had up to between 170 and 200 children learning Giri in schools each year at any one time. Unfortunately, they reorganised how they run the lessons in the last couple of years, and that has led to a substantial fall in the number of learners, because rather than the officers going to the schools, parents are now expected to bring their children to centres for learning Giri. It's kind of supposed to be better in terms of person power, but it's not been very good in terms of numbers learning. And like in Guernsey, it's not part of the curriculum. And the teaching methods, because again, the teachers are not trained to teach, particularly not to teach that age group. The teaching methods are fairly grammar, traditional, kind of writing-based, the kind of thing that older people would have experienced at school. And therefore, they're not terrifically inspiring to the young people. They have introduced a GCSE equivalent in Giri. Unfortunately, only one person has taken it and they didn't pass it, which is a sort of indication of the lack of I'm afraid, lack of success in getting people anywhere near fluent. And I think this is partly because of the lack of teacher training and the lack of opportunities for progression. Okay, most of the activities now are top-down. A lot, as I said, most of the native speakers and therefore the activities run by the native speakers, most of them are getting very old to retirement age, and therefore they're reducing their activities. So most of the activities now tend to be run by the office. And again, I think they are really kind of mainly symbolic. Even the lessons are mainly symbolic because they're not yet producing fluent speakers. And as I mentioned with that YouTube video, the target audience of a lot of the activities is really quite unclear. And I think this is really important to clarify who are we doing this for and what are we doing it for. Okay. Also, as the number of traditional native speakers declines, there's also a loss in regional varieties. They tend to promote one particular variety from the northwest, which is the most different to French, and also is the area from that the guy who produced the most widely used dictionary came from. And to date, there hasn't been a lot of documentation going on, so they haven't been recording the old people, which I think is a real problem in case the current activities don't work, as they don't seem to be doing. Okay. Another big problem is that because they haven't got any fluent younger adult speakers coming through, it's going to be very difficult to replace the current language officers when they retire, which is very, very shortly due. The language officers themselves, and two of them are in their 60s and due to retire. Okay. So I think it's really important to develop a new speaker community for small languages. An effective adult transmission of the language, second language learning, is essential for that continuity. But learning a small language is quite different to learning a larger language. There aren't many materials, there aren't many people to speak to, and you can't go out into the street and ask someone the way in the language. You can't often listen to the radio, watch the TV in the language. So, you know, I'm really interested in why people want to learn it and what they want to use the language for. And I've been asking some of you that question in the last week. Also, teaching techniques and the way that the language is assessed might need to be different. So I'm not sure GCSE is really the way to go, for example, for Giri. The way that I would measure even a small degree of fluency is basically the ability to have an impromptu conversation on a range of topics. And as I say, that's the benchmark I'm using with regard to the perhaps 6 people in Guernsey who can speak the language. And as I said, it's really important to understand motivation and goals. So what are we doing here? So I think language policy is not only about language, as a lot of it has got to do with promoting the identity of these islands. Targo Hiffenen, I think many of you have, or some of you have met, has written this. He says, Indigenous minorities are now seen as post-traditional speech communities, where microstates, such as here, promote and use their languages as symbolic assets for international commerce reasons and also to legitimise their statehood. And this is definitely something that Guernsey government is interested in. So all of these islands tend to promote the linguistic heritage for political distinctiveness, but for that you don't necessarily need the fluent use of living languages. All you need is a few words in the linguistic landscape. In Jersey, for example, in the museum, you've got a display of fishing in the olden days with a list of parts of the boat and their equivalent in Giri. In Guernsey, apologies for this, this is a postcard, 2 postcards that were sent to me by a young man, youngish man, who's he's made an interesting video about Guernsey. He did that as part of his degree at Goldsmiths University in London. And these are postcards that were issued by a estate agent when he moved house. And again, they're in what purports to be Guernsey. Actually, it's using the dictionary to do very literal, bad translation into from English. We'll be moving house. And again, it's this kind of very old-fashioned view of what the language is and what it's about. I'm afraid I managed to drop some water on this. That's why it's very. Okay, and as I said, the kind of activities that you get tend to be sort of generic old stuff. This is an inter-island festival that happens in a different place in Guernsey, Jersey, and on the mainland of Normandy every year. It circulates between the 3. And these are some ladies from Normandy, and these are some ladies from Guernsey singing their songs. And some of the people you saw at the festival earlier. Okay, so is it for the tourists? Here's a postcard with the weather in Guernsey, the Guernsey cow, of course, in various guises. This is at a cafe in the north of the island, telling the way to the toilets in Guernsey and English. And at the airport, this has now disappeared, unfortunately, because the airport's now under new management and it's got rid of any Guernsey that was there. This is the former airport manager, who is a Guernsey speaker, and saying things like, have a good time, have a good journey, see you soon, and watch out, I'm watching you, because this is at departures where you... yeah. Okay, or are they promoting the idea of language? This is a bumper sticker that I saw on a car, and it's saying, I'm from the Vale, which is the north of the island. Where are you from? And often the people's identity is not necessarily with the island as a whole, but with their locality within the island. The problem is it's actually very bad Guernsey. Again, it's one of these kind of literal translations, or perhaps done with the help of someone who's perhaps what we call a semi-speaker in linguistic terms. And likewise, these are examples of, this is the jewellery that the young lady was wearing that I showed you earlier. And this, again, it's the patois collection of jewellery. This here, the word, it's one, always and forever. You probably can't read this. They're engraved with various kind of endearing slogans in the language. And one of them is so-called always and forever. But the word here, I think someone must have written it down in handwriting and it was mistranscribed. And this is not even Guernsey, this is French. So it should be teru. And this word à la fin doesn't necessarily actually mean forever, it means at last. So, yeah. Yeah. But in a positive development, this company is now actually funding the translation service, and they're putting out a new range which is much better translated. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So. Some of you may know a little booklet put out by a couple of Gaelic activists back in the 70s, Ellis and McGovern. This is a really interesting quote from them. A language cannot be saved by singing a few songs or having a word printed on postage stamps. It's saved by its use. I know you're about to have postage stamps in Manx. These are postage stamps that came out in Guernsey a few years ago, actually quite useful for learners because they've got phrases that you can use and they're English translations, although it doesn't tell you how to pronounce them. Yeah. Yeah, to finish off, there are challenges, I think. The challenges include the lack of new speakers progressing beyond beginner level. This is really, really important, unfortunately. Ideologies that I haven't really gone into, authenticity, what is real language? There's a lot of debate about who should control language policy. Should it be the traditional speakers and their idea of how the language should be, or should it be younger people coming through? lack of opportunities to practice for learners and new speakers. I think people here have also mentioned this as a problem because most people don't speak the language. And therefore I think it's important to develop new teachers. And so if you don't have fluent older speakers, fluent adult speakers who are also trained to teach, then you're not going to get any children coming through or new adult speakers. And I think also, this is my ideology coming out of what a language is for. I think it's important to promote communicative use of the language, not just performance. Okay. So in terms of effective policy making, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all level. I think there's a lot we can learn from what's been going on here and also from other places around the world. But we also have to adapt what there is to our own culture and our own situation. A committed core of key campaigners who are going to take the language forward, I think, is essential. And also effective adult learning and teaching, as I said, and teacher training. Government support can provide resources. One thing that before the appointment of language officers in Guernsey and Jersey, some of the older campaigners were complaining that they were getting burnt out. They needed support from the government. The kind of support they got was not necessarily the kind that they wanted, though. As government support increases, though, what there is a danger of, and we've seen this in both Guernsey and Jersey, is that the grassroots movement can kind of wither away a bit, particularly as they tend to get older as well. So this is something to watch out for. Also, strategic direction and planning is really, really important. You know, what are we doing and where are we going with this? To clarify both the overt and the covert goals. So never underestimate the power of ideologies and attitudes towards the language, because I think there is still an undercurrent of negative attitudes among some people in all of these islands. But if we make them explicit, we can try and challenge them as well. And use the language. That's the most important thing. That's how I finish on that. Okay. Ala Feshoin, another bumper sticker. Goodbye in Genesis. Ala Feshoin. Merci.